Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we'll take a look at a fearsome variation of the Sicilian known as the Sicilian Dragon. The Sicilian Dragon begins with the moves pawn to e4, pawn to c5, knight to f3, pawn to d6, pawn to d4, pawn takes pawn on d4, knight takes pawn on d4, knight f6, knight c3, and now the signature move of the Sicilian Dragon, the move pawn to g6. Black's intention is to deploy the dark squared bishop on g7, where it attacks some squares in the center and puts pressure on the queen side. And in the Sicilian Dragon, Black quite often finds that he has aggressive and harmonious development, as the bishop's pressure on g7 often moves in concert with the ability to move the queenside pawns forward and even to find an opportunity for the rook to occupy the semi-open file on c8. But not so fast. There is a little chink in Black's armor in the Sicilian Dragon. By moving the g-pawn so early, Black creates just a small weakness to the kingside pawns where his king inevitably ends up. Practice shows that if White is very precise about how he plays the position, the movement of the pawn to g6 can actually end up having huge or even decisive importance over the course of the struggle. We'll get a chance to look at all of this throughout the video. Let's take a look. The dragon rises out of the Sicilian defense, which begins with the moves pawn to e4 and pawn to c5. With the move pawn to e4, White seizes central space and, generally speaking, he signals his intention to control the center with d2 to d4 on the next move if given an opportunity. With the move pawn to c5, the Sicilian defense, Black protects the d4 square with a flank pawn and makes the immediate move pawn to d4 quite unattractive for White. And now, White's most common plan by far is to seek the d2 to d4 advance by first playing the move knight to f3, followed by d2 to d4, so that the pawn can be recaptured by the knight. This way of responding to the Sicilian is known as the open Sicilian. In the open Sicilian, White nearly always gets a substantial early lead in development in exchange for the central pawn majority, since Black is able to exchange a flank pawn for a central pawn. But this is a risk that players handling the white pieces typically accept, since other methods of replying to the Sicilian do not allow White to gain the same huge lead in piece development. The dragon variation is just one of the many ways the open Sicilian can turn out. To reach the Sicilian Dragon, after the move knight f3, Black plays pawn to d6, a move which will turn out to be quite important, as we'll see in just a moment. And now pawn to d4, the exchange of pawns in the center, beginning with pawn takes pawn on d4, knight takes pawn on d4, and now knight f6, attacking the e4 pawn, and this right away shows why the move pawn to d6 was important, since here, if the pawn had not moved to d6, White would have an opportunity to play the move pawn to e5, gaining time at the expense of the knight and also some space. White now defends the pawn with knight to c3, and now pawn to g6, the dragon variation. It's worth noting that Black usually does not choose to play g6 before knight f6, since this would give White an opportunity to set up a powerful pawn structure known as the Maroczy bind with the move pawn to c4. In this position, the pawn on c4 helps to control the squares on d5 and b5, which are both going to be very strategically important as the game proceeds. Quite often, White is able to maintain the pawns like this for some time and use his extra space in the center to develop his pieces more actively. This all explains why Black first inserts the move knight to f6, calling out knight to c3, and only then g6 with the dragon variation. The knight is excellently positioned in the center on d4, where it limits Black's potential in important ways. For example, the control over the e6 square makes it harder for Black to deploy his light squared bishop to e6, while the control over the c6 square and b5 square is useful for limiting some of Black's possibilities of expansion on the queen side in important ways. White also has devoted fewer of his moves to the advance and exchange of his pawns. For the first 5 moves, black has used only one, developing a piece, whereas white has used 3 of his moves on pieces and still has the advantage of the right to move and deploy for a 4th time. The strength of black's position here is that his piece development flows with unusual ease. It is common for black to have difficulty finding adequate squares for each of his minor pieces in the opening. But in the Sicilian Dragon, black's early exchange of pawns on d4, combined with the fianchetto of the dark-squared bishop to g7, give his dark-squared bishop a real opportunity to contribute meaningful pressure down the long diagonal, perhaps in conjunction with the rook swinging to the c-file and the advance of the pawns as we've discussed earlier in the video. The queen's rook can easily be involved in the game, which is another benefit of the early exchange of pawns on d4. In fact, if white does not play precisely and aggressively, black's excellent piece placement and the possibility of advancing his pawns on the queen side can even give him a serious initiative. The benefits of fianchettoing the dark-squared bishop are massive, but they do come with an important drawback. The move pawn to g6 itself weakens the king side pawn structure, where the black king will inevitably end up castling. In the first place, this weakens the dark squares around the king. In particular, the f6 and then especially the h6 squares have been weakened by black's move pawn to g6. White can attempt at times to make use of this fact by, for example, playing bishop to e3, queen d2, and then at a later stage using bishop h6 as a way to exchange bishops and then occupy the h6 square with his queen. And this is all made directly possible by the fact that black has played the early move pawn to g6. Another factor related to the pawn's movement to g6 is that the pawn on g6 acts as what is called a lever. And that simply means that the pawn on g6 creates a convenient way for white to bring the power of his rook into the game by using the pawn on g6 as a lever with h2 to h4, h4 to h5, and then taking on g6. And this is a very powerful strategy for involving the rook on h1 into the game. This strategy itself is also made possible by the fact that black brings the pawn to the square g6 with the move pawn to g6. All of this helps to explain why white's far and away most popular approach to the Sicilian Dragon begins with the move bishop to e3, preparing to play queen d2 and castle the king on to the queen side. And this system of play is known as the Yugoslav variation. In the first place, by choosing to castle on the queen side, white ensures the maximum flexibility for his kingside pawns, since they can now advance forward without having to worry about protecting the king. In the second place, white leaves his rook on h1, which is a benefit of castling on queenside, so that the pawn can now continue the plan of h2 to h4 to h5 and taking on g6, and the rook has a substantial chance of lending its strength to a kingside attack. As an additional bonus, with the idea of queen d2 and bishop e3, white is already set up to prepare the exchange of bishops on the h6 square and bring the queen to h6, where she too can participate in a focused attack. After the move bishop e3, black generally follows up with bishop to g7, and now pawn to f3, covering the g4 square and preparing to continue with queen d2. If white continues with queen d2 without the precaution of f2 to f3, black has an excellent opportunity to play the move knight to g4, threatening to capture the strategically important dark-squared bishop. In those cases where this has indeed taken place, white generally continues with bishop to g5, and now, for example, black can continue with h6, bishop h4, knight c6, attacking the d4 knight now that the dark-squared bishop is offsides and cannot lend support from its normal square on e3. And now, the majority of games from here have continued knight to b3, bishop to e6, when black's pieces are developing rapidly, and the white position does not seem in any way preferable. So if we back up to the position just before white plays f3, we now understand quite clearly why white plays the move f3, covering g4, before playing the move queen to d2. You may wonder why black doesn't try to provoke the bishop with the move knight g4 before playing bishop to g7. And the answer to this, it turns out, is that white has the powerful move bishop to b5 check, winning material at once. If black blocks the check with knight to c6, there follows knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, and bishop takes pawn on c6 check, picking up a pawn and also the exchange. And other attempts to block the check, such as knight to d7 or bishop to d7, also lose material at once, as white can pick up a free piece with queen takes g4. Returning to the position after bishop b3, bishop g7, and pawn to f3, play now continues, castling kingside, queen d2, and now knight to c6. And with the move knight to c6, black completes the most obvious phase of his development. The move knight c6 has the additional benefit of adding a new defender to the e5 square. And this is actually important, since black now threatens to play the move d6 to d5, an excellent move for unlocking much of the hidden potential in black's position and threatening piece exchanges that ultimately tend to end up favoring black. The knight's placement on c6 plays an important role in making this break work, since it prevents white from simply pushing ahead with e4 to e5 followed by f3 to f4. Now, after knight c6, there are traditionally two major moves for white. One is to play castling queenside, simply continuing development in the most straightforward way possible, and preparing to generate an attack with the moves g2 to g4 and h2 to h4, h5, bishop to h6, and so forth. The drawback of this move, castling kingside, is that it still allows black the chance to play d5. Another equally popular approach for white is to instead play bishop to c4, putting the bishop in an aggressive location and helping white to connect the rooks at a later stage, and also restraining the pawn's advance to the d5 square. Now, while this gives tremendous energy to the white attack and ensures that black doesn't have that opportunity to initiate the pawn and piece exchanges in the center, the bishop does risk being kicked around at a later stage as part of black's natural plan to unfold his game on the queen side. Most often, white will need to spend an extra tempo repositioning the bishop to b3 in response to moves like rook to c8 or knight to e5. Black hopes to argue that these two tempi utilized by the bishop are an important factor. Whichever approach white plays, the theoretical verdict lies somewhere in between a definite initiative for white and equal chances for both sides. These positions are popular for both sides as they offer many chances for attack and tactical explosions in the middle of the game. I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to the dragon variation of the Sicilian defense. We've managed to just touch on the initial moves of the Yugoslav attack, but I hope that in looking at this video, you've gotten a sense as to why white uses this setup. By using the f3, bishop e3, queen d2 formation, and preparing to castle the king on the queen side, white leaves himself in the best possible situation to take advantage of the minute weaknesses created by the move pawn to g6. This opening leads to quite dynamic chances to both sides, and I hope you have great fun in continuing to study this opening. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.